Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the July Food for Thought seminar. May I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of a proud Noongar nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Before we start, I would like to share and remind you all that we are now accepting applications for our 2026 Research Awards, and you can visit our website to start an application. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Steve Webb. Dr. Webb is an intensive care specialist and a professor of critical care platform trials at Monash University. He is a past chair of the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance and the ANZICS Clinical Trials Group. He's a member of the NHMRC Australian Health Ethics Committee and chair of the Western Australian Health Translation Network. Dr. Webb has been an investigator on trials with an accumulated sample size of more than 80,000 patients, is a named investigator on more than $100 million of competitive research funding, and has published more than 250 manuscripts, including multiple manuscripts in both the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association, that have been cited more than 80,000 times. He has experience with Bayesian adaptive platform trials and other innovative designs, such as cluster crossover trials. Results from his trials have been incorporated into international guidelines and rapidly implemented into clinical practice, saving many lives. Please join me in making Dr. Webb welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Look, it's a great pleasure to be here. Can I just, before I get underway, work just with a show of hands, at least in the room, how many of you are clinicians? Okay, a relatively small number, and presumably the rest of you are science-based people of different types. Okay, great. So I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respect to elders past and present. But I also want to acknowledge those with lived experience and the contribution that they make to research endeavours. Just so that they're on record, I've provided my disclosures. So I want you to indulge me today because I really, really want to have a rant and a whinge. I'm also going to discuss a whole bunch of things which have some assumptions and also some connections. And if at any stage you think my assumptions or my connections are invalid, don't wait to the end. Just let me know at that time, and I'm very, very happy to take those questions at that time. So I'm going to make a number of assertions. Healthcare systems face increasing challenges to deliver safe, effective and efficient care. We were just discussing that, weren't we, Amanda? And until a couple of years ago, I worked here in the intensive care unit at Royal Perth Hospital. My friends and colleagues there tell me nothing major has improved in the couple of years since I've left. And when I left, it felt like just a slow-moving, rolling crisis. And every few years, there's some wave of reforms, and they're implemented, and yet they fail to sort of turn the supertanker around, and there don't seem to be any meaningful improvements. It just gets worse. Does anyone disagree that healthcare is a knowledge-based industry? Good, because I certainly believe it's a knowledge-based industry, but it's a rather important point for some of the assertions and connections that I want to make as the talk progresses. So I think healthcare asserts to be evidence-based, but I'm going to ask the question, is that really true? This is a painting of Charles Sidney Burwell. He was the Dean of the Harvard Medical School from 1935 to 1949. And one of his quotes was to the medical students as they came in at the beginning of the first year: half of what we're going to teach you is wrong and half is right. Our problem is we don't know which half is which. And have things improved since the 1940s? We've certainly got a lot more evidence. Indeed, there have been over 1 million clinical trials registered on trial registration sites in the last 25 years. So one could say we're drowning in evidence. But if you look at international clinical practice guidelines, which are where there are recommendations for how clinicians should treat their patients, and all of those guidelines are supported by varying degrees of evidence. And most guidelines also characterise the quality or the strength of that evidence. The green bars in this figure are the proportion of recommendations that are supported by one or more randomised controlled trial, regarded as the gold standard for generation of reliable and trustworthy evidence. And so you can see across a range of different disciplines, the proportion of guidelines, portion of recommendations in guidelines supported by high quality evidence sort of ranges from about 8 to 20%. But additionally, clinical practice guidelines generally apply to the treatment of individual patients. But healthcare systems are continuously implementing or modifying what would be referred to as system-level interventions. These are things that are applied to groups or populations of patients. They're things like policies, models of care, IT systems, imaging and diagnostic technology, how the workforce is structured, scope of practice, and of course, in this era, digital health and artificial intelligence applications. And at least unlike interventions that are applied to individuals, like drugs or surgery or other types of therapy, these sorts of interventions are rarely, if ever, evaluated to determine their impact on patient outcomes and on system productivity. And yet I suspect the capacity to influence patient outcomes as well as productivity of the system is just as substantial as the interventions that are applied at individual levels. So Mahatma Gandhi was once asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he said he thought it would be a good idea. And I feel much the same way about evidence-based medicine. If I'm asked, what do you think about evidence-based medicine? I think it would be a good idea. So I think we've accepted that healthcare is a knowledge-based industry. So this is what a whole array of companies that are in other knowledge-based industry, like software, pharmaceutical development, and automotives, spend as a proportion of their annual revenue on research and development. Varies from about 4% through to about 20%. And these are rational companies. And over years, these sorts of amounts of money, these very high proportions of revenue that are applied to R&D are relatively constant. And it's interesting, even in industries, you've got your Toyota, Volkswagen, Honda there, even though they spend a huge amount of their revenue meeting the costs of manufacturing cars and the very substantial capital expenses that go into factories, they're still spending large amounts of money on research and development. Australia spends about 200 billion per year on healthcare. And by my estimate, at most, we're probably spending about 500 million on clinical trials, health services research, and research translation. It's probably closer to 200 or 250 million. That's 0.25% of revenue. So healthcare is really something of an outlier in terms of expenditure on research and development. And maybe there are some good reasons for that. Maybe R&D expenditure in healthcare doesn't create value. Maybe we don't know the answer to that question. But a few years ago, when I was part of the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, I worked in conjunction with some consultants and the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare to conduct an economic evaluation of investigator-initiated clinical trials conducted by 3 different networks. Those networks were the Intensive Care Network, of which I'm part, the Neonatal and Perinatal Network, and the Stroke Trials Network. And over a decade, those networks had conducted 24 late phase, almost all of them comparative effectiveness trials over that 10-year period. And comparative effectiveness, I'll just define so that we're all on the same page. It is often the case that in clinical practice, there are 2 or more treatments that are part of standard care. All of those treatments are believed or known to be safe and effective, but it's just not known which one of those treatments is best. And the idea of a comparative effectiveness trial is to evaluate 2 or more interventions that have the same purpose, that are mutually exclusive options, but are part of existing standard care. And the return on investment was really quite substantial. The trials cost about $200 million to run. There were direct health service costs avoided of $600 million and patient health outcomes of $1.4 billion. And that turned out to be a 6-to-1 return on investment if you covered all of the costs of running the networks and all of their costs of running other trials that were not part of those 24 trials. And the return on investment to the NHMRC, which had funded all of those 25 trials, was over 50 to 1. So I think a reasonable question to ask is, what's the sweet spot for the proportion of revenue that should be spent on research and development in healthcare? And is it comparable to these other industries? So why do these companies spend the amount of money that they do on research and development? And what I'd suggest to you is that they could choose to not spend anything on research and development. Over the next few years, that would very substantially boost their profits and their shareholders' returns. But after a few years, they would find themselves no longer competitive and as a consequence, no longer profitable. And so there seems to be a different sweet spot across these industries as to how much should be spent on research and development to continue to be competitive. So they're determining their sweet spot of R&D expenditure to maximise productivity and future profit generation. Now, I don't know where the sweet spot is in healthcare, but I'm pretty sure it's not 0.25%. Furthermore, I think we make a big, massive structural mistake by the R&D expenditure that does exist in healthcare being largely delegated to universities and medical research institutes rather than determining where expenditure is going to be best by the people who are actually running healthcare systems. So you've listened very patiently through my rant. My source of frustration is there appears to be a compelling case that research and development should be core business for healthcare systems, but it most definitely isn't part of core business. Anyone want to argue with me at this point or challenge anything I've said? Okay. So now a long list of reasons as to why I think the healthcare system doesn't do R&D investment. The first is that just the demand for healthcare overwhelms the supply, so all resources that are available are just devoted to operational budgets. And it probably goes more than that. When I've spoken to people who are the chief executives of the health service providers in Western Australia, they actually say 98% of their time is taken up with managing operational challenges. And they wish that they had time to think about putting the health system in a better space in 6 months or 12 months' time, but they don't have the bandwidth to be able to talk about, to think about strategy. The other is that the timescales for evidence generation and operational decision making are completely incompatible with each other. Research takes way too long. Health service chief executives want an answer in 7 weeks, not the 7 years that it often takes for many trials to be completed. And it's just way too expensive per unit of applicable evidence, and they really wouldn't know where to start. A typical large-scale NHMRC funded clinical trial will have a budget somewhere in the sort of $5 to $7 million range. That's a huge amount of operational expenditure that you would be taking off the table, and it's just not possible to do that. And as I said, some of that R&D spending is delegated, but the people to whom it's delegated have incentives that are malaligned with the needs of the healthcare system. So pharma, biotech, medtech, they just want to sell products, and the evidence that they generate is generally the minimum necessary for registration and/or reimbursement. If it's a drug, it needs 2 randomised controlled trials to be licensed, and the threshold, the bar, is set at a very high level. But for devices and digital and AI interventions, it's a much lower bar. It generally just has to be that the intervention does what it says on the label. It doesn't have to be demonstrate safety and effectiveness the way that drugs do. And of course, once a drug is licensed, clinicians are free to use it off-label for any use that they think is professionally appropriate. And so important things for decision making by healthcare systems, like comparative effectiveness or cost effectiveness, just aren't generated. I'm in a university at the moment, I believe, but the incentives for universities and medical research institutes are also malaligned with the healthcare system. The incentives are predominantly about winning grants, getting publications, getting high impact publications, perhaps generating protectable intellectual property. And appropriately in research, there are very high evidentiary standards and requirements. Otherwise, it's not possible to publish in peer-reviewed literature. But maybe healthcare systems don't need such rigorous methods. I initially tried to fit this on one slide, but I needed 2. The next problem is what's known in philosophy as the free rider problem. If one healthcare system chose to spend a lot of money on research and development and worked out how to do better healthcare, that's not protectable intellectual property. Once it's in the public domain and published, other health systems can read the literature and implement that evidence without generating it. So nobody generates the evidence that's necessary to improve healthcare. I think it's also the case that amongst clinicians, health service leaders, I don't think the deficiency of evidence, which I tried to demonstrate earlier, is really well understood or even widely acknowledged. Furthermore, there's just no history or culture of doing research and development within health systems. And then there's too many legal entities. There's 6 legal entities that deliver public health in Western Australia. There's 77 in Victoria. There's 15 in New South Wales. Each of them makes their own independent decisions. And so if you wanted to generate evidence systematically to improve healthcare, there's going to need to be cooperation and collaboration between healthcare providers to achieve critical mass and sample size. And that is a major barrier. And I think lastly, there is to some extent limited understanding of the potential value of reliable evidence, as well as what constitutes reliable evidence. But probably the biggest one is this: though all of those other industries that I mentioned have shareholders, and if they're not profitable and productive over a period of time, they're takeover targets or they go out of business. And we don't have those market forces that exist in healthcare. Please.
There is a very strong market force actually on healthcare, which is that of the professionals in there. And I hate to say consultants, the consultants in a hospital, because they want to protect their their profession. So, for example, nurse endoscopists, nurse anaesthetists, actually applying really rigorous, cost-effective sort of.
So both examples of workforce changes that are, exist in the NHS.
Yep, they exist. A nurse anaesthetist also exist in the US,
Yep.
which God knows is a very litigious healthcare system. But certainly in my experience of things like the clinical senate and discussions, where there may be a removing of essentially some of the income, interests, etc., that within a specialty, for example, there is a complete and absolute block to that happening. I mean, I remember as an example being surprised when I did some RMO time at King Edward as to why there was always someone from paediatrics present at elective Caesars, because there weren't at vaginal deliveries, and the elective Caesars, for heaven's sakes, were the least risky births. Then I realised the reason was because in the private system, the attendance of neonatologists at elective caesarean sections was a very large part of their income. And if they were not doing it in the public system, it would be very hard to justify it in the private system.
In which they were probably an outlier in not accepting differences between the public and private sector, because such differences are very common across a range of disciplines. I'm just being sceptical.
So there are all these
perverse incentives.
So the market forces are actually the powerful groups within
Yep.
the hospital that defend the status quo.
They're definitely forces. They're not market forces that create discipline around productivity and quality of product.
There would be a lot of changes. So certainly in serious sort of high level discussions, that it's a no-go zone.
Yep.
That would potentially.
So let me indulge you in an anecdote about how Australia was established. We were founded, the post-Indigenous colonisation of Australia was by the British. The first fleet and the second fleet went to Sydney Harbour, and they brought convicts who did the work to try and make the colony feasible and viable. The business model for that was that it wasn't the Royal Navy who transported them, it was a commercial operation. It was done by ship captains who were paid according to the number of convicts that they loaded onto the boats in England, not on the basis of the number of convicts they delivered alive to Sydney Harbour. So the first fleet and second fleet mortality was about 10% per of the convicts. And the whole colony is just weighing in the balance, uncertain if it's going to be viable. And they changed the business model for the third fleet to paying the ship captains according to the number of live convicts that they delivered, and mortality was 0.5%. So as Gary Becker said, humans respond rationally to incentives as they perceive them. Fee-for-service medicine in the private sector is a lot like the business model for the first and second fleet. Salaried practice, which we're used to in public hospitals, is a bit like put as few convicts on the boat as possible and cruise around the Mediterranean where the weather's nice. And there's nothing in that middle model where clinicians are paid according to the outcomes that they achieve for their patients. So I think across this area, there's a lot of anthropology, there's a lot of tribes, there's a lot of turf being protected, and each of those groups has different degrees of control and power and influence, and we start from a position where an enormous number of the incentives are perverse. So, how could healthcare R&D expenditure be done better? So I'm here today as the chair of the West Australian Health Translation Network, the WAHTN. The Health Translation Centres are organisations that have both health service delivery and research and innovation partners and members. WAHTN's got 21 members. All of the public HSPs, as well as the West Australian Department of Health, and several private health service providers. And then I think it's 6 medical research institutes and 5 universities. And the broad purpose, at least as the NHMRC, which accredits research translation centres, is asserted that the research translation centres are intended to act at this interface between healthcare delivery and research and innovation, with the broad goal of making healthcare delivery better and more sustainable. Amanda, there are some problems that, that can't be solved. Many problems that can't be solved. But these are the objectives for the research translation centres in their most recent round of NHMRC funding. And so the highlighting and some of the edits are all mine. So promote engagement between researchers and end users. And the end users are health services, clinicians, consumers, to improve Australian health services or health systems. Conduct research and research translation activities and associated capacity and capability building that are the priority of the health services, not the priority of the researchers, and are in alignment with the strategic objectives of the RTCs with the goal of improving Australian health services or systems. And then lastly, they want us to get some of our money from the health service providers, sure. So what research methodologies would be most useful for healthcare R&D? I suspect many of you in this room do discovery bench science. You're probably not a surprise that that's not mentioned in any of the list of methodologies that I'm about to run through. So the first is evidence synthesis, which is just taking existing literature and aggregating it and searching it to provide often a systematic review or a meta-analysis. I suspect there are occasions when the health system has a problem and the problem has already been solved. The answer exists in the medical literature, but the health system doesn't know the solution exists, and evidence synthesis is a way of bringing to them high quality, reliable evidence in a synthesized way. The next is implementation science, which is a relatively new methodology, but it comes from the frustration that often there is high quality evidence about what should be done for patients, which is not implemented into clinical practice. And so a big component of implementation science is about how evidence that should be translated is actually effectively translated into practice and policy. There's a whole genre of health services research, things using data linkage, and typically observational or descriptive methods of analysis. But these are ways of identifying things like unwarranted variation and hypothesis generation. I think clinical trials, randomised trials, are an important part of how to improve healthcare. These could be comparative effectiveness. It could be evaluating the true effectiveness of an intervention that is suspected to be of low value care. It might be evaluation of new and expensive technologies before they become widely implemented. And for system level interventions, which I talked about earlier, it's only cluster trials that are the appropriate methodology because they randomise populations rather than individuals. Health economics is clearly a critically important methodology. And lastly, high quality consumer and community engagement and involvement is a cross-cutting methodology across all of those different research methods. So what design features should a research translation centre apply to best support healthcare R&D? And I think there are 2 elements that are important. The first is that co-design with health service partners and with clinicians within those health services is absolutely critical. And the other is that they need to be solving real problems for the health service partners, not what the researchers or innovators think are the problems. So what sort of evidentiary requirements do healthcare systems have to guide better decision making? So I would strongly assert that the evidence needs to be reliable and trustworthy, which generally means randomised methods. My opinion, and it's just an opinion, is that health systems shouldn't be making decisions on before-after comparisons or observational analysis, which is about as good as it gets currently, and a lot of it's a lot worse. Importantly, the endpoints that are used to evaluate an intervention, be it at individual or system level, should be those that are meaningful to those who have to make the decisions. And so I frequently think that one of the problems that occurs in evidence generation at the moment is that when it occurs in universities and medical research institutes, because of the absence of co-design with healthcare systems, there's no prior establishment of whether the endpoints will actually be sufficient to change clinical practice. And so effectiveness is largely evaluated through patient-centred endpoints, and a patient-centred endpoint is something about the way a patient feels, functions, or survives. And then economic endpoints have also got to be important, related to the cost of services or the productivity of services. Ideally, evidence should be generated at low cost, or at least at low marginal cost, and it needs to be much faster than can be done currently. It needs to match those operational requirements. Ideally, it's embedded, which means there isn't a separate research and clinical delivery silo. There's a single integrated silo that can do both, because there are efficiency and governance advantages of doing research that way. And I think, and this might be controversial, I don't think it needs to necessarily meet publication standards. We are slaves to a p-value of 0.05, but maybe a value of 0.1 is enough for healthcare decision-making, where decision-making can also, and evidence generation can occur in a much more iterative way. And I think it's important, and I do this from a Bayesian perspective, to undertake sensitivity analyses to understand confidence and credibility around results. And lastly, it should have the capacity to evaluate these system-level interventions. So this is the model that has been developed at WAHTN, the proposed process. We want to have a process by which health service organisations have primary responsibility for identification of their problems. And I understand that that is an incredibly challenging activity to undertake, because if you ask a HSP chief executive, what are your biggest problems, you'll get one list. If you ask directors of medical services, you'll get an overlapping list. If you ask consultants at the coalface, you'll get a different list again. And if you go into the doctor's common room and ask junior doctors what are the problems, you'll get another list. And if you speak to people in quality improvement departments, you'll get yet another list. And all of them probably have some validity, and a lot of them probably interconnect and flow back to very high level themes. But the intention is to have a process that identifies problems, to then have WAHTN having a role to identify and prioritise those which might be research amenable. They'll be shared with the research and innovation members of WAHTN, with the goal of establishing project teams to develop specific project proposals, and those that have been endorsed by WAHTN will aim to take them back to the health service providers and see if any of them make sense to the health services. And if the health services endorse a project as being appropriate to try and solve a problem, then we're in a position to try and generate funding proposals to do those projects and try and solve some problems. So WAHTN is not a doer, it's an enabler and a facilitator, and I'm very interested in feedback about its proposed strategy. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your wonderful overview of where we are and all the problems that we're facing. I'm sure there's a number of questions. Can I ask from a WATN, the Western Australian the Health Translational Network, what has so far been achieved? What are the successes? Where do we see? What are the KPIs? And it has been around for many.
It's been around for a decade, and when I was approached about taking on the role, I held the view that it had done very little, and I think I still hold that view. However, in that regard, it's not unique. I think the other 11 research translation centres have done very little. WAHTN has done some really good things. It has really advanced consumer and community engagement and created tools, expertise, approaches which I think are amongst the best in the country. And it's also had a highly regarded research education training program, but neither of those are either translational research or research translation. And so I don't think any of the RTCs around the country are doing what the NHMRC believes that they should be. I was in a meeting in Canberra in February with the First Assistant Secretary who's responsible for the MRFF, and this is a direct quote: "We are sick and tired of the amount of MRFF money that is going into universities and medical research institutes, and we see nothing changing in the health system."
No, excellent point. Just one follow-up question with the FIRE grants here in WA. How does the Health Translational work? Do you work with them directly? Is there
we don't work with them directly, but I'm presenting the strategy to the Minister in a couple of weeks' time. And I would be optimistic that the strategy is highly aligned with the objects of the Fiery Act. I mean, one of those objects is explicitly to try and make the West Australian health system sustainable. And so if you look at the current fiery funding schemes, I don't think there's anything particular which is well aligned with this strategy, but I'll be advocating for something in this space. But further than that, the Fiery Fund is now looking at distributing about $80 million a year, which is a useful amount of money. But it may well be that MRFF or NHMRC money is going to be necessary to fund these sorts of projects. But I'd like to think that a grant that starts with this project has been co-designed by and endorsed by all health service providers in Western Australia is at least the start of a grant that will have people continuing to read it.
Excellent news. We've got a few questions. Leon, I'll start with you then.
So one of the problems about market forces are markets are influenced by a lot of different things besides profits. So I'm reminded that in Victoria, when they brought in activity-based funding, they gave the HSPs the opportunity to compete and also to get out of areas. All 8 HSPs at the time decided they'd get out of ageing and mental health. So there's, and when we look at HSPs and what they choose, they don't choose their problems usually. They choose what they think is glamorous, interesting, or would appease certain political masters. So we have the problem that for the last 20 years, the biggest problem facing the West Australian community has been the ageing of the population, which has occurred at a faster rate than the rest of Australia because we started from a younger population base. Despite that, ageing has never been a priority in this state. And even though most of the people sitting in those ambulances, in the 14 ambulances out the front door, are old people with complex problems.
Yep. And when they sit in an ambulance for 6 hours, they used to be able to walk.
That's right. And then they get sent to an AMU where they don't receive the sort of care they require. So we have this problem that the HSPs don't necessarily see the problems they've got. They don't want to invest in it.
So they will definitely identify ramping as a problem.
Yes, but they don't see what causes that problem.
No, but that might be water to which the horse can be led.
Yeah, it's extremely difficult to explain to HSPs that they're not getting it right because they're listening to a level above, or they're listening to the people with the most voice rather than trying to look
And
at
what
their
I would
needs.
suggest is this is a framework to generate reliable evidence that if you implement this intervention, this is its effect, this is its impact on patients, its impact on productivity, and its impact on outcomes.
Such evidence exists,
Yep.
and
And
this
so maybe
state,
it doesn't need new evidence, it just needs evidence synthesis.
the state disinvested at the same time as the evidence was produced.
Look, the activity-based funding was one of those waves. I don't think it's done anything particularly meaningful. It's had perverse incentives. It caused some hospitals to concentrate on what they thought were the most financially lucrative DRGs. There's a very crude system used in terms of the KPIs that chief executives respond to. They respond to ED waiting times. They respond to elective surgical waiting lists. So partially maybe. But even then, what you've got is very blunt instruments, each of which is capable of having perverse incentives. You know, is even within a field like elective surgery, is it more important to take 10 people off the waiting list for a problem which is of relatively low impact versus being able to operate on someone's cancer more quickly than would otherwise be the case? And the 4-hour rule, I mean, Amanda might want to comment, but to the best of my understanding, it led to an increase in the number of admissions with...
4-hour rule's a classic case because it was introduced in this state after a systematic review had already shown that it would not do anything except increase waiting times.
Well, I don't know that it's ever been evaluated in a way that would generate reliable evidence.
The systematic review at the time, but it was introduced in this state, which because it had already been used for 10 years in the UK.
Where it was subsequently abandoned.
Because of the systematic review showing.
Yeah, but I still don't think that systematic review is based on it's not based on randomised evidence.
I mean, what I can say at the time working in the EDs is that it improved a lot of things, but then because there was the way it was done was concentrating on trying to unblock the steps that were blocking, and it did work. But now what's happened is that that's just been overrun now because of the increasing blockage within the hospitals, which is not amenable. Or the things that it's often the downstream things which you will understand with things like social care in the home, with more nursing home places, more rehabilitation places, etc. And so we're just blocked by other things. And so now it's
The evidence showed.
yeah, but that's because it's not because the 4-hour rule isn't a good thing. It isn't a good thing. It's that if you don't put in the reforms in the following steps and where people have to go, you will end up back in the same situation.
Yeah, I don't know the evidence well enough, but I'm fairly certain that it was never evaluated in a cluster randomised way in the UK at the time of implementation.
But it had many before and after studies showing that it didn't work.
Yeah, and before or after studies, in my view, would not be a reliable form of evidence.
Yeah, I did have a question. So I think there's one enormous piece that's missing from that translation, which mirrors the evidence that mirrors what happened in the homeless team. So I was the clinical lead for the homeless team for 10 years. And the biggest problem is not doing the studies. We had good evidence that a homeless team would work. There was evidence from around the world. The problem is that if you want to get something, some innovation or change into a hospital, you have to get long-term funding for it. And that's the problem with I call it the furry fund, is that what they do is they fund lots of pilot projects. And then the vast majority of those will go into what I call the pilot project graveyard, which is we've got this great evidence of a different way, but if you're going to bring an innovative program in, you've either got to spend more money, which they absolutely do not want to do, or you have to destroy something that is not working as well and replace it with the innovation. And that becomes very complicated.
Do you think uncontestable evidence of impact on economic endpoints.
Makes no difference
Really?
whatsoever, because the HSPs are absolutely concentrated on trying to bring their budget in on time. And in fact, the recently appointed CEO of East Metro, that is one of his 3 top priorities, is to bring the budget in. So there is nothing that's about patient care in there. It's about bringing the budget in. But you have to destroy
but my question
things.
was about economic endpoints.
No, it does. We did. We had excellent. We got excellent health economics. We were able to clearly show a benefit, really, from fairly early on. That is not enough.
In a before-after comparison, or
We did what. Well, you can't randomise people to homelessness or not.
no, but you could randomise hospitals to whether or not they have a homeless service.
Well, the problem is we get the vast majority of homeless people, so you're
Across enough health
slanting it.
systems, you can do that. So I would assert.
So in the end, what we had people who specifically pushed the evidence. It was agreed by Treasury on the basis of the economic data that we presented, and after 10 years we got long-term funding, but the cost of that was me paying somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 of my own money to keep the team going for long enough with paying wages, money for money to spend on various things. But very few people would do that. And so even with good evidence, there was all sorts of stuff which meant that it should go on, but still we didn't have enough money for this, we didn't have enough money for that, and it was only after 10 years that finally we got it. But I think
So I think the part of the problem is that there are no shortage of people going to senior leadership within HSPs or the health department and saying, I've got good evidence for this. But in reality, they don't have non-contestable evidence. And in the absence of it being non-contestable, it won't drive decision making. The Treasury is the group of people who have most to gain.
Yes,
from this.
look, I understand all of that, but the problem...
they will make rational decisions when they are convinced by the evidence.
The vast majority of pilot projects, because that's the problem, we're stuck at pilot projects.
Pilot projects don't generate evidence that is sufficiently reliable or trustworthy for decision making.
Yes, but the problem is you can't get the money to do the next ones, and that is the problem, because they only fund pilot projects.
But it may be that they shouldn't be funding pilot projects.
So it should be that there's a mechanism, if you have good evidence, for extending them if you need more evidence, and for putting them into long-term funding, because that is the most important thing.
Funding should probably be much more iterative than it is. So run a pilot and see if something's feasible. If it's feasible, then generate high quality, trustworthy, reliable evidence as to whether it improves patient outcomes and impacts the economic things which the Treasury is interested in.
Yes, but the Treasury, so the problem is that the HSPs are not interested. So getting to Treasury is actually really hard. You have to have people in the health department, which is what we had at that particular time, who were prepared to fight very, very hard to get the long-term funding. But most of the things, and most of the researchers, the HSPs are not particularly interested in that. They are more interested in keeping their budgets under control.
But this is starting to feel a little bit circular. What I'm advocating for is giving HSPs the evidence that is necessary for them to make rational economic decisions. I think they are. You've just told me they're interested in economics and holding their budget.
As long as everything is cost neutral, We don't have money for that.
Sure. I think we can have that discussion a bit later. We'll just give other people the opportunity. But, just to that point, implementation science, you mentioned you had high on your priority list. Is that something that could help to bridge that gap we're just talking about?
Well, I think you start with implementation when there's evidence for which there's consensus that something has crossed the threshold. But too frequently, we even fail at that hurdle.
Another one here, people, and then Carl.
Mine's not necessarily a question, but also I think just some information about the, I guess, finances that like East Metro is potentially looking at putting towards research. So I actually think my position is a good example of it. So I am a very new position in East Metro. I'm the appointed Director of Research for Allied Health. That is a conjoined appointment between East Metro and Edith Cowan University, really looking at how can we actually build like research into East Metro, considering the various allied health departments, of which I did have a bit of a laugh to myself. Your strategy and my strategy looks very similar. So thank you. One of the things I have noticed is there is a huge amount of intrinsic motivation from clinicians to do research. And in terms of identifying incredible patient-centered questions, it's phenomenal. Like, honestly, the list is huge. Really where I think our departments and what I'm going to be trying to work with them is trying to streamline where are their top priority problems in those allied health departments so that we could effectively bring them towards researchers such as yourselves in the room so that we can start working collaboratively together to formulate what is the question. They're bringing those questions from what they see every single day and what they have deemed in their department as something incredibly important because it has an ongoing impact within that system. But also one thing I do note is that I don't necessarily want these clinicians coming into a very passive kind of research collaboration. I don't necessarily see researchers having to do all of the work in terms of, okay, you have to do the ethics, you have to do the analysis. I think there actually needs to be some form of active collaboration between both sides where there is still some form of supervision, mentorship. So there is some research skills and capacity being passed down towards these clinicians while they're working in the role so that they get that benefit as well. So we can start bridging this gap a little bit more. So I
think that's a great example of embedding, of how you go about it, trying to embed research within healthcare delivery. At least when I was at Royal Perth, it seemed to me that whenever the budget was under stress, the usual strategy was to not renew the contracts of allied health professionals because they were the people on short-term contracts, with no understanding of what downstream consequences that had in terms of the proportion of patients that failed to rehabilitate and ended up occupying beds for long periods of time before they went to nursing home placements. What I'm talking about is trying to develop a framework and a model where, rather than just cutting that which is easy, if you're going to cut, at least understand the consequences of it.
Thanks so much. Carl.
I have a couple of questions. My first question is, I'm not an implementation specialist, but my question is there actually evidence that implementation medicine improves implementation?
Which type of medicine?
So implementation is how do you implement stuff? It's a new specialty area. Is there any randomized evidence that actually using an implementation approach is a serious question?
No. I don't know the answer. It's a very, very good question. I don't know the answer to the question. I think it's a wonderful rabbit hole, and I want to dive down it because I'll give you a comparison of two healthcare interventions that were both invented in the mid-19th century. Anesthesia which made surgery possible, was translated incredibly effectively. The first anaesthetic in the Southern Hemisphere occurred in Tasmania less than 6 months after the first anaesthetic in Boston, at a time when news of these sorts of things only moved at the speed of sailing ships. That was good for patients. It was also good for doctors. Another healthcare intervention that was identified about 2 years different to anaesthesia was Semmelweis and washing hands. That's good for patients, doesn't make any difference to doctors, and we're still struggling to implement that one. We are dealing with human beings, and they are very complex organisms. I think false positive implementation, adoption of healthcare interventions that are attractive to clinicians without high quality evidence is probably more of a problem than is the failure to implement evidence-based and cost-effective interventions. When I was an ICU registrar, there's some of people in this room will know Brad Power. Brad was a fantastic friend and clinical mentor, and I was just starting to do a Masters of Public Health and start to understand a little bit about epi and biostats. And I said to Brad on a night shift, how do we decide which new interventions to use in intensive care? And he went, oh, Steve, that's easy. Expensive, dangerous, useless, fun. And so a lot of things get taken up into healthcare because you can't show your face as a radiologist if you haven't got the best MRI scanner in your hospital, and yet the hospital down the road's got an 18 Tesla, if that's where they're up to. There's no respiratory physicians in the room, are there? Good. Respiratory physicians want to do lung transplant. They don't want to optimise people's bronchodilators for asthma or manage their rehab with COPD. People want to do the sexy, cutting-edge things. But it goes back to those perverse incentives. So implementation flows both ways. It's a fantastic question. I wish I knew the answer. Next question.
I think it was, I was asking it to back up the fact that I'm very supportive of what you're trying to do. We definitely need new approaches. The mountain is complex and huge. There's also a misalignment in funding. The health service providers have their agenda. They can complain terribly, people can complain terribly about how MRFF funding hasn't made a massive difference. I would argue that it's not been available long enough to have a big impact. If you look at the time frame of things, I think it's unreasonable expectations to some extent. But similarly, it's not so easy to change things in clinical practice. And one of the biggest problems we have is a misalignment in funding, because the way that the funding works is not going to incentivize health service providers to address things. The example you mentioned, for example, about managers laying off allied health services people when the budget gets tight, that would be a fantastic randomized trial to do. But we will never do that. The thinking is completely wrong. Everybody said the clinicians are extremely enthusiastic. And I agree. I do. The one thing I've disagreed with what you said today was a thing you said in jest, which is that public services medicine is a bit like taking a cruise in the Mediterranean with as few people as possible. I can see that from an incentive point of view, that could be tempting, but I would argue that most people here, or a lot of people here, have trained in the NHS, where people are tremendously underpaid and overproduce, relatively speaking, because they're just absolutely committed.
I do not disagree with that, Carl. But I think we, to an extent, and it's probably more apparent in the NHS than it is here, The system is held together by the altruism and goodwill of people. And I think the NHS, that goodwill has eroded a lot over the last 5 to 10 years. I think people were very burned by how they were cared for during COVID. And more recently, it's become apparent that at least junior doctors have massively fallen behind in terms of salaries. And we've seen 3 years of industrial action by junior doctors. So there's probably a limit to how long goodwill and altruism can be assumed to keep the system afloat.
Probably 5 to 10 years behind the
Yeah.
NHS.
Yeah.
It's definitely happening here. We lost almost all of our senior nurses and staff after the COVID.
Yeah, exactly the same thing happened in the Royal Perth intensive care. There was a time in the Royal Perth ICU where staff turnover was probably 1 or 2 or 3% a year, and it was usually for the usual reason. I think we were having 10% turnover a month post-COVID, and invariably it was newly minted nurses being thrown in at the deep end and then emotionally struggling with the responsibilities that they had, and they wouldn't stick at it long enough to become capable, and just a revolving door. It was dreadful.
Yeah, ours were senior. They just had enough.
Yeah, and it was, if I can rant a little bit longer, it was because no one thanked them for what they were doing during COVID, let alone giving them a retention bonus to stick around during a pandemic.
Well, we didn't even have a bad one.
Correct. That's well, we went a bit over time, but I think we're talking here about fundamental issues for most or all of us in terms of the research, the health services, etc. So a very big thank you to Steve for coming today, talking to us. We really appreciate the work you do. I think you would also have sense that there's willingness by the community at large to help, to assist, to provide whatever's needed. We really appreciate all the work.
We want, the WHN wants to try and do something in this space, and the more engagement we get, the better.
Absolutely. Let's engage. There's still a bit of lunch. Please join me in thanking Steve for a fabulous presentation. Thank you.